Streaming live around the world, this is Paper Cuts with Brad and Jay.
Hey, what a stupid question.
Oh, I've already had 2 glasses too.
Jay, you've done so good, and you have to muck it up right at the end. Jay's gray. He's all gray now. Look at his beard.
I got grayer, right? Everyone in the chat, thanks for stopping by and enjoying yourselves. We know you did. There's 3 legends here with us.
Tonight, we discuss Where Dark Things Grow with author Andrew K. Clark.
Welcome to the show.
All right, happy stormy evening, depending on where you live, depending on where you're joining us. Brad, you getting storms down there?
Yeah, a little bit.
In Kentucky land? Yeah, up
Kentucky
here in
land,
Ohio too. Paper Cuts on the air once again with you. Your favorite people, of course. Brad's over there. I'm Jay. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, we get to talk about Where Dark Things Grow. Both Where Actual Dark Things Grow and the book titled Where Dark Things Grow. See what I did there? Welcome to the program, novelist and poet. And I know that's correct because that's what he has on his website. Novelist and poet, Andrew K. Clark. Andrew, good evening. Thanks for joining us. How are things?
I'm doing great. I'm still blown away by that great intro video. Like, these other podcasters have got to step up their game. I mean, that thing is like professional, and yeah, it's pretty badass. But yeah, doing well down in North Carolina. No storms tonight. Little bit of a fall nip in the air, which is kind of nice for us.
Is it starting to get chilly down there a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. No,
okay.
We do we like to do falls, right?
Yeah.
So, you'll have the nice days in the low 70s, and then the next week it's back up to 90s. So I don't know if we're done or not, but this
right.
70s.
Some of the mornings up here in Ohio have been like, 50, 51, 52.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, here we go. And then by like noon, it's like 89. I'm like, what the hell just happened?
We've had some of that too.
It's like 3 seasons in one day.
Yeah, the same thing here. You'll have it, and a couple times a year here, the heat's on in the morning and then the air conditioner's on in the afternoon.
Yeah.
It's like, what the fuck is happening?
I refuse to put the heat on yet.
Yeah,
I'm not doing it.
I'm turned off.
Yeah, I'm not doing it yet. I know it's football season, but I'm not turning the heat on yet. So
we do the same thing.
Right.
It was 100 degrees last week, Jay. You can't put the heat on yet.
That would be kind of weird. Snowing one day.
In your home, you can do it.
Snowing one day, cutting grass the next. That's how Ohio is. So
yeah.
Yeah. What are you normally doing on a Friday night besides talking to us?
So normally on a Friday night, my wife and I tend to watch movies on Friday nights. So It's kind of like the work week is done. We're kind of beat. So we hang out and watch movies. So this time of year, probably be looking for a horror movie. So that's a typical night for us. Nothing too exciting.
What horror movies? What new ones are out? I want to see I haven't seen Maxine yet. I want to see that.
Yeah, I want to see Long Legs. I haven't seen that one yet.
Yeah, Long Legs.
Yeah.
I think it's on Prime, but I don't see paying $20 for it yet.
I'm sure it'll be
it'll be something free eventually.
Yeah, I've been watching some old ones, Rosemary's Baby, stuff like that.
Good.
Catching some of that stuff.
Some of the classics.
Yeah.
So I mean, those are dark.
They are.
See that segue that I just did there? That's professionalism right there, guys.
That's I like that smooth.
So yeah, let's get into it. Let's unravel quite a few dark things here, because this book has some heavy subjects. And that can be a little risky, I think, with this being a debut novel. I know you have a poetry collection now, but this is your debut, correct?
Correct. It's my first novel.
So you just right out of the gate, you're hitting some heavy subjects here with the quite a few things in it.
Yeah, I think the books I connect with, there's like some kind of level of honesty that's there, and so I'm trying to capture that with the novel. So it's kind of like I tell people when I wrote my poetry book, it's called Jesus in the Trailer. For years, I resisted writing about anything related to religion because I was raised in a very fundamentalist religious household, and then something happened when I let myself go there. Right, something happened, and my writing connected with more readers and things like that. So I'd say that's kind of the same with this book. Just trying to be totally honest with, be willing to go there, I guess.
So for those that don't know, give us the elevator pitch. What is Where Dark Things about?
Yeah, so Where Dark Things Grow is set in 1930s in southern Appalachia. It's set here in Asheville area where I live. And so it's during the Great Depression. There's a 15-year-old boy, who's kind of our protagonist. He's growing up. Family's having a very difficult time. Dad goes missing. One of the things he has to do in the novel is try to help find his dad. Mom's kind of struggling with mental illness, and then he's got a sick baby sister that they're worried about dying. So he's got a lot on his shoulders for a 15-year-old. So part of his journey is, again, looking for his father. And on that journey, there's another thread in the novel where women are going missing, right? They're being kidnapped. We learn later that they're being trafficked. And so he comes across a group of females, and so he knows one of the girls that's going missing. And so along this journey that he goes on with his best friend, and she becomes his love interest, Lilyfax. The two of them kind of get pulled into this, what they think is a rescue effort to try to save these girls that are being trafficked.
Where'd that name come from, Lilyfax?
Yeah, so I
mean, out of everything you just said, that's what's.
Yeah,
I was reading. I was like,
wanted her to have a kind of a unique name, and so I like with sort of a lot of the magical realism stories. There's characters with names that are not conventional, and so I'm an old school Tolkien nerd from middle school, and so there's a Gandalf's horse is Shadowfax, so I took a common name from the 30s, Lily, and we got Lilyfax.
See, I mean, to someone who doesn't know anything about Tolkien and all that, I mean, I needed that explanation because
yeah.
You also have one of the villains. His name's Goat.
Yeah.
There's another character whose name is Goat. He's kind of maybe the villain's henchman.
Yeah.
And I say maybe the villain because maybe the villain you think is the villain is not the villain. But
there you go.
Readers will have to kind of dig into that a little bit.
Right.
So right off the bat, why did you want to set this in the 1930s instead of present day or the 70s or 80s or anything?
Yeah, I tell people, I think this story, a lot of the realist side of it. So I describe this book as Appalachian Gothic horror magical realism. That's kind of a mouthful, but in magical realism, there's always like a gritty, realistic side where magical shit is happening, and so that would be kind of contrast from fantasy where there's this world building. You build this whole other world. And so in magical realism, there's a very grounded, realistic setting. So I tell people probably influenced by that time period and that setting by my grandparents. So that's the age, the 1930s when my grandparents were teenagers.
Right.
And so they grew up in sort of poverty in southern Appalachia outside of Asheville, about a 30-minute drive from Asheville. And the way they kind of described the experiences of the Depression always struck me because it was different than everything I read about the Great Depression. So if you do something like look at the history of Asheville and the Great Depression, prior to the Great Depression, there's the 20s, there's this huge boom, right? There's kind of this gilded age. Late 1800s, early 1900s, George Vanderbilt comes and builds the Biltmore House, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald is here. Zelda Fitzgerald is here. Thomas Wolfe comes out of Asheville, right? And so there's this kind of gilded age, this story that you hear about Asheville. Very popular book called The Last Castle is about the Biltmore House. Good book, but what you see is kind of this story of that gilded age, right?
Okay.
Then there's a fall from grace in Asheville, right? So literally banks runs on all the banks, real estate companies collapsing, men throwing themselves out of buildings in Asheville. That happened here. It wasn't just in New York City. It happened in Asheville, right? Yeah. And so you had this big shift from where there's all these tourists coming and there's these health notions about getting the mountains and you can breathe better. There's TB and people coming here to try to get, what they presume is the mountain air is better for their lungs and so forth. So mass group of folks just visiting here. And then there's this fall from grace. But in listening to my grandparents' story, who were dirt poor before, during that entire Gilded Age, right? And the Great Depression happens and their lives don't change at all, right?
Okay.
So to me, like one of the things that's interesting about my story is it tells that other side. So the folks that were, if you're driving, 15, 20 minutes in any direction outside of Asheville in that time period, you're going to be seeing abject poverty, shacks, people hungry, things like that. A couple chickens in the yard, trying to sort of scrape out an existence. So to me, that was very interesting. So again, I tell people this was influenced by listening to my grandparents talk about, their teenage years growing up in the 1930s. And to me, and that big contrast between what you see elsewhere, particularly pre-Depression, Again, it's kind of a gilded age all across the country. New York is booming. Charleston, South Carolina is booming. Asheville, North Carolina, booming, right? And then there's this big bust. But for folks out in the rural areas, nothing changed.
Right.
As a matter of fact, my granddad would say that their life got better after the Great Depression because his dad got work at the TVA.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And so to me, that was kind of an interesting time period to sort of explore. And I liked, I like fantastical stories. As a teenager, I was reading Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, things like that. As I grew as a reader, I'm digging like Murakami, folks like that, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the magical realists. And so I like that juxtaposition. And to me, it didn't feel so incongruous with the way I grew up thinking, because there was this religious background where, there is this notion of spiritual warfare. Like, humans are kind of pawns in this spiritual game between good and evil. So to me, the fun of the story is sort of taking that stuff out in the open, right? So there's, magical creatures. There's these Wulvers that walk around on two legs and things like that, that come from sort of Scottish folklore. And, one decision I made when I started the story, and I knew I wanted to have these magical elements, I decided I was only going to bring things from my sort of cultural background.
Right.
So there's a temptation being in the North Carolina mountains, and I've seen writers do this, both Native American writers and non-Native American writers bring a lot of some Cherokee folklore and stuff into the story. But I decided I was just going to use things that were kind of from my cultural heritage. So in tracing my family tree, my family moved to North Carolina. The Clarks landed in New Bern, North Carolina in 1739. And so we've been here since before the Revolutionary War. So that's one reason that I felt comfortable kind of using some Scottish folklore, sort of mixing that with things that we had here in the local folklore.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to get into the Wulvers here shortly because they're pretty badass. But it's cool because it's like your research you did for this is talking to actual people instead of, there's the book information, doing your research of the history of the Great Depression, and what's recorded for that time in history for people to go back and do their research. But it's a different story when you're talking to someone like your grandparents who lived through it, who has these experiences that you can use and kind of put and use those in your book. Because I think it's a different kind of research that you did. So
yeah, and I would describe like the language of the characters from this 1930s period. That's the voice of my grandparents, great uncles,
right.
Old widow that lived in my neighborhood that I grew up with. She's kind of an inspiration for a character in the novel called The Widow, right? Uh-huh. And so what I really love that sort of way of talking. And one thing you see, I think I read in your information, Jay, like you're Gen X, or I'm Gen X, right?
I'm Gen X.
One thing you see is this migration and that loss of that beautiful Appalachian vernacular over time.
Right.
Because, as kids, we were watching movies from all over the country and we had video and things like that. So it started to change for us, right? But it's even more so now when you talk to, like my kids, right? That voice changes. So one thing that I was very attracted to doing is kind of trying to capture that voice that I heard in my grandparents, the way they talk, the way they express things, their superstitions, their sayings, all that kind of stuff.
And it wasn't overused too. Like you could tell, I've read books before where the writer, and I'm not going to call anybody out on it, but when the writer uses too much of the vernacular and they're trying too hard, and it's pushed and it's
absolutely
it's right in your face.
Those,
you're like,
it
gets a little cringy.
It's one of those things that like less is more. So once I establish the character and kind of give you some of that vernacular, I can kind of back off. Now I don't want them to sound like a Cornell professor by the end,
right? But not every word has to have.
Not so it's so hokey that you can't stand it. Another decision I made here. There's a villain in the story called Mr. Wake, and he's Norwegian in background. Mm-hmm. And so that's also from my heritage. So I felt comfortable, using that. And, the very beginning, he has a very stilted sort of like a vernacular, the way he speaks. But over time, I eased off that as well, because you could see like it would get tiresome over, 300 pages. Right. Yeah. So, less is more with those things. And you're absolutely right. New writers sometimes try to keep that authenticity so tight that it's too much work for the reader.
Yeah. It's exhausting a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So why did you want to pull the Wulvers in out of all the stuff you could have pulled? First of all, what is a Wulver for anyone who doesn't know?
They're badass, man.
They are. So they're a very cool Scottish legend. So these are supposedly wolf man-like creatures. They're really wolves who can kind of like walk on their hind legs, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of an interesting idea to me. And again, sort of spending some time researching my Scottish history. Like my wife and I went to Scotland in April, things like that. And so it kind of interested me, but also I have, like that Game of Thrones fanboy brain as well, where like there's these dire wolves that the people can kind of control with their minds a little bit. And so my Wulvers, what we see is the main character, Leo, gets tempted with the control of a Wulver. At least he thinks he's in control of it, and it does things that he wants it to do. And over time, there's sort of becomes more of a question, like, is it controlling? Are you controlling it? Is it controlling you? Like, what's actually happening? And I wanted to play with that. But yeah, so the basic idea is from this Scottish Wulver legend, and they're used very differently than the way that I use them in this book. If you look at some of their lore, they are very benevolent creatures that, like, maybe if your family's struggling, they'll put
they help
fish
them, right?
in your windowsill and stuff like that for
right.
people to, so in my case, there's a benevolent one and there's a evil one in the story. And so again, the main character Leo is tempted with the evil one. Suddenly, this very powerless 15-year-old family dysfunction, all these issues, things he's struggling with, and suddenly he has a lot of power. And the idea of, like, what does that do to someone who suddenly gets all this power? Can they handle it? And we see kind of a migration. He starts off with like very good ideas about it, and then it tends to digress from there.
Brad, do you have those pictures I uploaded for us, or?
Yeah, so that would be
for that to be like
that would be a lot of what I'm visualizing, right? And of course, mine is described as like being almost a shadow, like it has a little bit of translucency and things like that. But this would be kind of what I'm basing it on. So on all fours, they're as tall as a horse. So when they stand, you can imagine sort of how big they are. That's a very cool picture.
I'm just waiting for like a sports team to use them as a as a mascot or something.
The Wulvers.
Yeah,
well, I mean, what sports over in Scotland? I'm showing my ignorance here. Do they play soccer over there? I'm guessing the Scotland Wulvers.
big soccer fan for sure.
Yeah, that's what we're going to see next.
You're gonna have the kilt on one of them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, growing up, I've seen those creatures before. I don't think I knew the name of them were as Wulver. I don't think I knew that until I was doing some research for the show here. I'm like, oh, I've seen those. You see them in comic books, and you see them in like cartoons and stuff, and probably horror movies and all.
There's a lot of cryptid, sort of like history with using wolves in that kind of cryptid history too.
Right.
So that was something else I also looked at, and I just felt like there was a lot of great fiction already out there, kind of using some of the things that I was looking at using. And so to me, it's like a little bit different. But again, my Wulvers are more have maybe more in common with like the dire wolves in Game of Thrones, right? They're a little bit different.
Yeah.
Just reading the synopsis of your book, when it said Wulver, I was just picturing like a werewolf, but that's not what it is. It's not a man that
trains.
They're always in that half man, half wolf form.
That's right. It's always in that same form, right? And I try to leave. There's pretty good description of them in the novel, but also like I want the reader to kind of complete that circuit and see what they want to see too. But I thought they were kind of interesting. We don't have wolves historically in this southern Appalachian mountains anymore. We used to, and around the 1890s, they became extinct. We hunted them until they were extinct. And then there were some efforts in the 90s and I think in the early 2000s to reintroduce them to the area, but there's just not enough. They kept getting out and finding farms and killing cows. There just wasn't enough wild game for them. So so that's sort of use something totally foreign rather than this idea of since we don't have those. Unfortunately, we don't have wolves in the mountains anymore. We've got coyotes, which we exported from the southeast. Or southwest, I should say, and then we have lots of foxes and things like that. Bears, brown bear, black bears.
You mentioned talking about religion earlier, and I wanted to ask, and maybe there's nothing more to it than this, but you're talking about God and religion and belief and stuff. With the two Wulvers, you have the silver Wulver and the shadow Wulver. Is there any more symbolism to those two in any religious aspect other than just one's good and one's evil?
I don't think so. I think that's really it. And my theory behind it is Leo, he kind of sees them that way as one good, one evil, because that's the way he sees the world. So if you talk to people from my grandparents' generation, grew up in that religious tradition, like it's zeros and ones, right? There's not like kind of a fuzzy area between the two. And so I don't think they're necessarily pure evil, pure good. But that's the way Leo sees them, and the other characters, that's the way they interpret them, because that's their sort of philosophical worldview, right?
Right.
And then with the you talk about poverty at the beginning as well. I felt like that was, at least at the beginning, that was sort of the driving force behind the narrative of being in poverty, and that's one station in life, especially Leo, because he's not happy with being looked down upon. His family's always looked down upon, and when he does get this power, he kind of takes that towards the revenge path in a way to get back at the people who've looked down on him. So was the poverty and kind of the lower station life, was that a driving force for the narrative, at least at the beginning?
Yeah, again, the idea to try to tell the story of sort of Western North Carolina, that it's not that there haven't been many novels written about poverty in the South, obviously, right?
I've read one or two, yeah.
So there's a lot of that out there, but again, thinking about like the Western North Carolina age, the sort of gilded age of that period sort of outshines that narrative, if you will. So I was really wanting to kind of tell that story. My grandfather, like I said, they grew up in poverty. They were hungry, like a lot. There were days that you subsist on rice, right? Things like that, and white potatoes. People don't think about rice, but that's what you could get really, really cheap at a general store, right?
Right.
So if you had some bad crops that year, and you didn't have a lot of stuff put up, your potato cellar wasn't in good shape, then you got very, very cheap rice, and that's what they ate and lived on. And so one thing, again, a lot of the little anecdotes he told from his life made their way into this story. And so, like, one example was one of the houses they grew up in, and they moved around a lot because they were kind of tenant farming, and Dad was always looking, sort of shifting work and so forth. So they moved around a lot, little rentals. They were sort of homesteaders and tenant farmers, right? And so one of the stories he told is one of the old sort of like one room house that they lived in. So it was he and I think 4 brothers,
right?
And they all lived in this house. And one thing about the house is it had wood beams for the roofing. And so these would contract and expand. And so in the wintertime, they kind of curled up so the rain would come in, right? And so you would try to position your pallet on the floor, right, made out of hay. You try to move it to where you could be comfortable. And one story that he told was in the wintertime when it snowed, the snow would come in. And so there would be lines across their bodies as they're sleeping. And they had a wood stove in the house, and like the snow would hit it and it would sizzle and everything. So that some of that stuff made its way into the story. And I had a few people read it kind of in the beta stage, and they're like, I don't think that could really happen. And I was like, it happened, right? Another example is in the story, Leo is taken by his father to a brothel in Asheville.
Yeah.
And so that's a big part of the story. That's where we find some of the girls that are kidnapped are actually, from that brothel. So I also had beta readers say, like, I don't think a dad would take his son to this brothel. Well, my great-grandfather took my grandfather to a brothel, and he was sent along with my great-grandfather by my great-grandmother, who thought, oh, this boy will modulate his behavior. He won't be in town drinking or.
But things were different back then. Okay.
Fair, right? There was no phone. There was none of the stuff that we have now.
You could drink at 12. It's different.
You could drink at 12. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my granddad smoked it, probably 10 years old and drank and everything. So, but anyway, my great grandfather would take him to this brothel, and he'd just like, you sit in the corner while Dad goes upstairs. Right. Yeah. And so that made its way in the novel. But what was fascinating is that's the number one thing beta readers kept coming back and saying, like, that wouldn't happen. I was like, it fucking happened. Right.
See, so, I didn't think that was unrealistic at all. Like I was totally, that totally happened back in the 30s.
Yeah, no, it happened.
I mean, it happened back in the 30s, and it could happen today. There's some bad dads out there. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Okay. So it could happen today, Any dad could take their son out to Vegas, and like, hey, we're going to visit one today. It's not too unrealistic, So
But that again, this part of the story, most of the story is obviously fiction, but there are a few of these little nuggets that came from my granddad. So it's a very long-winded way to say, Brad, yes, trying to capture that poverty, that time period. And also we see in the story the sort of beautiful gilded Asheville, right? That gilded age Asheville. And then what it looks like after, when there are soup lines, people standing in line to get food and bread, right? We see that in the novel. But what we also see is for Leo and the people, Lilyfax and Ezra and other people back where they're out in the valley where they live, like nothing changes, like absolutely nothing changes. As a matter of fact, nothing changes for Leo until he gains this new power from the Wulver. And then he's able to kind of, at first he uses it to try to improve his station in life and help his family and things like that.
Right.
Nothing changes until that point.
I think it's cool you mentioned that you added these little nuggets like from stories you've heard, because I think that just enriches the tale overall. The snow coming through the roof and making lines, and the dad taking the kid to the brothel. It just enriches the story overall. I think that's really cool that you added those in.
True historic fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it has historical fiction elements. I mean, some of the places that I mentioned in Nashville are real. I did make up a few places. The brothel's obviously made up, and also there's a boarding house that they visit. And it would have been kind of cute to say, maybe use Thomas Wolfe's mother's boarding house or something like that. That just felt too cute. So I made up that entirely just to kind of stay out of that, stay in my lane a little bit. So from a historical fiction perspective, those things, it's kind of a mixture, right?
So I wanted to ask, why did you choose to have the protagonist, Leo, Lilyfax, Ezra, all of our characters were getting the perspective of be teenagers, be kids instead of it being adults as the story?
I think I don't think when I started, like I had this idea, like I wanted to write a coming of age story. That's obviously what I did. But I think for me, like when I initially started it, there's just kind of this innocence that, we have as teenagers, this world, this way of kind of seeing the world, and also like being willing to look and accept magic in our lives, right? So your imagination is probably your strongest when you're a kid. And then over time, life sort of chips away at it. And if we're not careful, we can kind of lose that. So to me, a lot of the stories I like, have kind of that element. And so what I liked about it in this story is they approach everything with kind of an innocence.
An innocence, I was going to say, a lot of innocence there.
Yeah, even like, later on in the story, they befriend a couple of Black characters, and trying to think about like grown people in the 1930s. They weren't likely to develop those friendships, particularly in this class of people, right? Poor people just didn't have those opportunities to meet each other, and we're victims of a lot of racism and propaganda about each other around labor and all those kind of things. Not unlike 2024 sometimes, but, but yeah. So that would not have been realistic, but it felt like as teenagers we could accept some of those things and see some of these relationships develop that maybe wouldn't otherwise.
It was a little bit more accepted back then, and I guess you could say
at that age,
right. Like you said, a lot of the innocence of the kid, and you can see kind of the innocence being lost as the story goes along. All of these teenagers, because they're starting to realize certain things are happening and they're growing up quick, So, and
that's why I think we, and I say we, like the collective, I think a lot of us like these coming of age stories. One thing that's been interesting is I've gotten some early reviews coming in for the book. People have referenced Stand By Me, the Stephen King movie. I guess it's based on a book of a different name, which is escaping me right now. But that movie, The Body. Thank you. And so we are attracted to those, I think, because there is, we see in ourselves and we see in our kids that loss of innocence, right? Yeah. It's kind of a bittersweet thing. Like your kids are going to grow up and they've got to, become sort of streetwise and understand what's happening in the world and all those things. But it's kind of painful too. Mm-hmm. And as we reflect on our own, like we can see those moments, just little things like I've talked about with others, but like that, we all have that moment, like when you're a child, like your dad can hang the moon, right? Does no wrong, is amazing. And there's this point where you at that point where you realize that your dad's not perfect, right? And it's a little bit sad, right? And it's not that people have to be superheroes their whole lives or anything, but it's just there's a moment where you kind of recognize the humanity, the fallibility of the people that you as a child you might idolize.
Right. what made you decide, and this might be somewhat of a loaded question, but you hit so many genres in this. Like we were talking about the Great Depression. You could have just kept it that, you know, but no, you had to throw some horror, some folklore into it, the magical realism. You had to, you know, combine all of these. It's loaded because one, why did you just decide to put all of these different genres into one? And two, did you ever lose track of what you were writing while you were writing this? Like what direction you were wanting to go for that particular part? Was it too much horror at some point and you had to pull back? Was it too much folklore you had to pull back?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we tend to, as writers, we can do two things. We can write for the market, right? We can write to like, this is what's selling right now. I got to write a book like this, like X that's on the shelf that's doing really well. Or we can write what we like to read. Right. I think those are kind of our two primary choices that we had to make. So with this, I wanted to write something that I would like to read. And I am drawn to stories that bend or subvert genre.
Okay.
Right? I like the fact that, you know, Murakami takes, you know, a realistic setting and does really weird shit in it. And then there's like this alternate universe he goes to, and now there's 4 moons in the sky. And like, I just love all that.
Well, I'm convinced that he's always high when he's writing. So,
well, I think that's probably,
that's
probably,
he's under some sort of substance.
Well, we know Stephen King, a lot of his great books, you know, he was like, they have people ask his secret. He's like cocaine. Like that's,
he doesn't remember the Langoliers, I don't think.
That's right. And Cujo.
He doesn't remember. Cujo has no memory.
Cujo's the one he has no memory of. But so I think for me, like if you kind of looked at my reading journey, again, starting out reading fantasy, being really interested in it, growing up in a religious fundamentalist home where there's this, you know, I'm reading the Bible, right? The Bible's being read to me, and there's a lot of supernatural shit happening in the Bible as well. So I had kind of that foundation. And then as I grew, I came to love like the realistic Southern writers, the Ron Rashes of the world, the Charles Frazier's of the world, folks like that. And so at some point I kind of got the idea of like trying to combine those things. And so I wouldn't say there was like in the beginning, I was like, I want to bend genres. It was more like, I want to write a story like I want to write. And then it was like, okay, as after that, as every writer knows, after you finish that, you know, horrible first draft, like how do I whip this thing into shape? So there were some more fantastical scenes that were cut, right? That didn't really necessarily feed the story. And I broke my heart because it's like, this is really some cool shit and I want to cut it, but it didn't feed the story. There was also some like fun and games elements along the way. Like there was a scene where Lilyfax and Leo wind up going dancing in a barn with a bunch of folks or a moonshine crowd and everything. And I loved that scene. It was just beautiful, but absolutely did not serve the story at all. And so yeah, I went down lots of different paths, but again, I think that I kind of came to this over time, and you know, I did some shopping of the novel. It took me a while to find a publisher.
Okay,
and I think part of that reason is because what you say. You know, you may see like a big New York publisher, a big New York agent that says on their website, "We love things that bend genre." No, they don't. They really don't. Okay.
Yeah.
And honestly, you can look at their list of books that they publish or whatever and see that they really don't. They really want something that kind of fits in a box, and it fits in a box of what they see that's currently selling. Yeah. And so, you know, had I taken that first approach and said, I want to write for the market, I would not have written this book.
Right.
Right. To Brad's point earlier, they probably wouldn't have been teenagers. Right. Because that changes the way you think about it, too. It's not really a YA novel. Doesn't have that YA voice, but I did all the major characters are teenagers.
Yeah, you'd probably do some fun if he was writing for the market. I think. I mean,
yeah, no,
I'd rather write what I want to write.
I think you're right. I mean, and I think too, like if you try too hard to do that, like you have to. It's like a formula, right? It's sort of sucking out like what organically can happen, because a lot of shit that happened in this book surprised me. You know, like we went down different directions. Like, holy shit, I didn't think that was going to happen, right? And that's the part what's really exciting for me as a writer. People always talk about the plotter and the pantser, right? So the plotter maps out the whole story from the beginning, soup to nuts, and then sits down and writes systematically, scene by scene. And then the pantser just kind of jumps in and sees what happens. I tend to start out as that pantser, And then maybe, halfway through, I become more of a plotter, because then I start to see the shape of the story and realize things I've got to go back and fix and so forth. But I like that pantser act of discovery. So art as an act of discovery rather than going in with a preconceived notion. I may think I know what's going to happen at the end, but it's beautiful in those moments when I realize, oh, that's not what's going to happen. To me, that's really cool.
We're going to save your quote. I was reading the Bible. There's a lot of supernatural shit going on. So we're going to.
No, it's true. Yeah.
I know. But just,
we can blurb that. We can put that as a blurb for my next book. I'll get canceled, and then there'll be this big old thing and sell more books.
Trust me, we're not high up on anybody's religious list for the show.
I mean, you even talked about, even in the book, you talk about Jesus exorcising the demons into the pigs, and the pigs, you mentioned that in the books. That's some supernatural stuff that happens.
Yeah. I mean, those things happen in the Bible. And if you grow up in a household where you're taught that is literal truth, you just believe that's what happened, right?
Yeah.
Until you maybe get older and gain a little bit of perspective. And then, I consider myself a Christian now, but I see a lot of those things that are in the Bible as allegory, right? I see them as the storytelling tradition that the Greeks and the Hebrews were all doing, right? So, it doesn't feel far-fetched when that's part of your literal upbringing and literal storytelling tradition.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's what all the Psalms are. They're stories, allegories.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Song of Solomon is one big long love note. It's beautiful, and it's racy, it's spicy. If you really read and think about what it's saying, some of that stuff would fit right inside a romantic novel. A romantasy, which is really big right now. So the Bible's pretty rich with all that stuff. One of the most interesting classes I ever had was a Bible as literature class. It was a very cool class.
Space erotica, is that what you said, Jay?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. No, read Song of Solomon. Read it.
So you mentioned some of the early readers, they were coming back saying, "Oh, the father, son at the brothel, that wouldn't happen." All this stuff. Did you get anybody confused because of the blending of the genres? They didn't know what direction you were going, or was it pretty obvious to everybody with your early feedback while you were getting this book ready?
I mean, I did have some folks that would say, would want, kind of question about that. Where are you kind of headed with this?
Yeah.
And the very, very early readers, I'm like, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But one thing that was extremely helpful in this story is I had a number of female readers, and we have as one of the.
That was my next question, actually.
Yeah, one of the female victims of this sort of trafficking scheme that's going on in the story was African American Black woman, and so I had two Black women read early drafts of the novel, and they gave me just tremendous feedback in terms of thinking through. One thing that they, not just those two ladies, but also my wife and some other early readers, Megan Lucas being one of them, a fan of the pod.
Oh yeah, I've heard of her.
Pod.
Yeah.
So
just a few times. Yeah.
a few times.
Name dropper.
Famous Megan. So one thing they push me on, if you think about stories that show victimization of women. So you take your average HBO crime series and see the women are cardboard. They're just police lines, chalk lines on the floor, right?
Yeah.
Or we hear very little about them. Oh, she was a stripper, right? That's all we know. And that's all that the story thinks we need. They exist in a one-dimensional plane, right? So one thing that happened early on is some of the early readers are kind of like, you could tell their stories a little bit. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. And so one thing you see, and we have points of view chapters from 3 of the victims that are involved. And so I think what happened in that, and again, that great feedback I got was just making those more well-rounded, interesting characters so that we are invested in them. And again, they don't become like cardboard cutouts, right? Hopefully they have more depth. They don't have a lot of real estate on the page in some cases, but hopefully what's there conveys something about them as human beings and their humanity, and they're not just victims, right?
Was it fun writing those little vignette chapters?
Those were they were so much fun. Yeah, those were really fun. And what I did for folks who haven't read the book, so most of the novel is in third person, most of it's in Leo's point of view. But when I wanted to capture these scenes with female characters that were, again, victims, what I wanted to do there, I needed to get as close to them as possible in sort of brief amount of time as possible. This couldn't be a 500-page novel, right? And so those chapters are written from first person point of view. So it was a tremendous amount of fun to think through like how they would see what the male characters are doing, getting kind of their perspective. And one thing that I learned in kind of writing them, that these are not docile women. Like they're pretty badass. They stand up for themselves, and they play a pivotal role in in what happens in the novel. And so writing from those points of view, and I did a lot of drafting of that, where some of that didn't make it into the book, but writing those and getting into their heads was just like incredibly fun and rewarding. And the feedback I've gotten is that I did that okay. And it's always something you have a little bit of trepidation about, writing as a white writer, writing black characters, or
that's what I was going to say, because that's a risk in itself. This day and age to not only write from a female perspective, but from a black person's perspective also.
Yes,
combine those together. That's a risk, but you took it.
Yeah,
and it was good. You have people telling you go ahead and do it.
Yeah, and again they made it better. I thank them in my acknowledgments because I know they helped me do that better than I would have on my own. But I think what's important is you kind of think about, and this is just like, this is Andrew philosophy. I don't think that I would want to extrapolate this to all writers. But in general, I think that if I'm going to write in an experience that's not my own, like I want to have I don't want to center that character and center myself as speaking for that character. Does that make sense? So I wouldn't have tried to write this novel entirely from Vay's point of view, an African-American woman, just because that's centering me or centering her in a way that I can't necessarily speak for her. But I'm all for writers having diverse cast of characters, particularly when they would fit. And if you do any kind of research for 5 seconds on human trafficking, you see the biggest victim pools are indigenous women, African American women, and then poor white women. So that's what's represented in my story.
Right.
And it never felt like with those chapters that you were trying to appropriate anything or anything like that. So
I tried hard not to. And again, that's one reason I chose to sort of use folklore and legends that I could sort of trace to my own ancestry. That felt like really important to do, and not appropriate anything there. One thing we do, I do try to mix in things that would be from the time period and from the geography. So for example, the villains in the story wear wooden booger masks. Well, that is a Cherokee piece of art, right? But I make very clear it's white men wearing this. So to me, that felt absolutely accurate, because there is always cultural appropriation that white folks will do of the other, the way they would call it the other. So to me, like that felt like an acceptable use.
Yeah. It's a little bit more tastefully done that way. I think it's not glorifying any of the situation just to get the extra eyes on it. I mean, it's telling of a story in a tasteful way to bring that point of view to that's part of the book. So
yes, and I do think it's important to for writers to be careful about who they center in their stories.
Right.
But I also think it's important for us to tell diverse stories when they're accurate. Right. But we kind of bear a special burden if we decide to do that. And so I think I got it right based on a lot of feedback that I got. But there may be readers that think I didn't, and that's absolutely fine. That just my burden was to do the best I can in that, but in taking that position.
As far as like the myth and folklore you included, obviously the Wulvers are pulled from myth and folklore. Was there anything else in here, like as far as like the butterflies or the crystal rabbits, or is that just all magical realism you made up?
Yeah, I kind of made up those, and there are probably lots of stories that have magical bunnies and butterflies and things like that. But if you kind of
acid trips,
if you read any kind of magical realism, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there'll be like moths will fall from the sky and stuff like that. So to me, it's just more of just trying to make things like a little bit off and away from that realistic point of view. So just kind of playing with those things.
Right.
Yeah. I want to talk about the Blue Man because I thought he was an interesting, without trying to give too much away. I thought he
Yes.
was a really interesting villain. So can you speak a little bit about him as much as you want to divulge?
Yeah, and he was probably the most difficult to write. Because he is the person who's primarily responsible for this human trafficking scheme. For folks that haven't read the novel, and that's not really given too much away. That's on the back cover of the book.
Yeah.
So he was a really like a challenge to write because here we have a human being that's doing something absolutely deplorable, right? He's a terrible human being. But how do you write that character where he's not flat and a one dimension? Like there's a bad guy. He's a and it's not.
He's twirling his mustache and
yeah, he's twirling his mustache and he has a hideous laugh or what whatever the case may be. And so he was very difficult to write because what I wanted to show with him is some nuance and some humanity. So one of the things that the story does tell a little bit about his backstory, where we learn a little bit about why he maybe sees the world the way he does and why he's making the decisions he's making, and also kind of show like some vulnerability. He has some vulnerability. He has some like mama issues. He's got some stuff going on, and so again, and then he also has a code where there are certain things that he considers to be unethical or immoral, and he has lines he won't cross. Which you think like here's this person like dehumanizing entire class of folks and allowing violence to be perpetuated beyond on them. But then he has kind of a code that he in his own mind, he thinks he's showing respect.
Right.
Right. Obviously he's not. But so he was a very rewarding character when I got that right. But it was this balancing act. So like one decision I made is here we have this book that's dealing with human trafficking and violence against women, misogyny, all those kind of issues. But none of that ever occurs on the page. Like I made a decision early on, like I'm not going to go there. Right. Yeah. So to me, I didn't think there was a way that I could do that as a male writer and represent, someone who's really a victim of sexual assault, like what, how they would really feel or anything like that. So all that occurs kind of off page. But Mr. Wake, the Blue Man, he was a challenge to write because I was always sort of this balancing act between making sure, yeah, we know he's a horrible human being, but there's a little more there.
Yeah.
One of my favorite scenes with him was, I guess, closer to the end of the book, where he's one of the women he's captured. He's giving her a bath.
Yes.
It's not like in a sexual way at all. He's like very gently, like cleaning her feet between her, like Jesus, cleaned the disciples' feet, going back to the religious thing. And I felt like that made him all the more threatening with how like gentle and quiet spoken he was in that particular scene. Because the character he's doing that too is like in the back of her mind, she's like, "When's he gonna snap? When's he gonna hurt me?"
Yeah,
she's just waiting for that.
That was a scene that I wanted to, try to capture again that nuance to his character and have him do something that you don't really like up until that point. There's nothing in the story that would indicate that he would be gentle like that and kind in a moment. And so that was something I tried to do with both he and Goat. So there's this sort of big brutish character, Goat, kind of Mr. Wake's henchman. And again, I didn't want him to be a one-dimensional, just a big buffoon walking around beating everybody's ass, right? And so he has a moment where he shows another side of his humanity. Still a bad guy, still, nobody you want to hang out with and drink a beer with or anything like that. But there was some humanity there. So to me, I think that's important. I think the best villains have some level of that so that they're not just, again, like a one-dimensional, like a toggle of 0 and 1. They're just evil person.
Right.
And it's hard to do because, again, when someone's doing something like Mr. Wake is doing, like, I don't make him look good. And so I tried really hard to make sure that even like in the bath scene and other things that happen, we don't go down the path of too much of the male gaze. I mean, it's inevitable because I'm a male writer, but try to make it not prurient and in a way that it's sort of a nuanced story.
Right.
That scene with Goat, you give him, you feel that little bit of empathy for him. Him, like his face is looks really old and wrinkly and stuff, but the rest of his body looks young.
Mm-hmm.
We don't ever know why that is. So just assume he probably got picked on if that's the way he's looked forever as a kid and all that stuff, and probably wasn't ever loved. And there's that one moment of empathy where you kind of feel bad for him.
Yeah,
he's
and
done terrible stuff the whole time.
And that's what I wanted. I wanted the reader to be like, I hate this guy, I hate this guy, I hate this guy. Oh, there's a little more to that.
Poor
right?
guy, and then you hate him again.
and not to again ever take away from like the terrible things they're doing, right?
Oh yeah.
But at the same time, to sort of like get it, even when people do evil things, a lot of times we can look in their histories and find out, like, well, something was happening to them terrible when they were a child or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so again, it's not to make an excuse or gloss over the action, but at the same time, I think humans are more complicated than an easy sort of black and white 0 and 1 kind of description of them.
Right.
Yeah, you get that little glimpse into maybe what made the discovery of what made them why they are why they're doing these things.
That's what I wanted. Yeah, I wanted the reader to again, for them not to be a caricature in the same way that the female victims are not caricatures. Hopefully, I wanted the same thing for the sort of these evil characters that are the villains, if you will, protagonists, antagonists, I should say.
There's also like with the whole Wulvers and Leo, like he gets this power, and then he uses it. He enacts revenge, going forth, try on the people that have kind of wronged him and try to get money to help his family out. But I feel like the whole book, in a way, parts of it at least, are kind of about gaining power and then the abuse of power upon others. So was that kind of a theme you were going for, kind of the abuse of power?
Yeah, I did. Once I realized kind of what Leo's story arc was, I did want to show like the corruption that power brings, right? And we see it in our lives. We see, people who do really well in the business world or whatever, and then gain a lot of power stuff, and suddenly become like, idiotic assholes, and we're like, what happened? Like you were this idealistic person with all these great ideas. I mean, hello, Elon Musk, right? And so, I did want to kind of tell that story. So also I thought it was kind of interesting to think about a character who's had no power, no agency, right? So even compared to like his parents, Leo has less power being 15, but certainly in society, his family has no power, and he has even less than his parents do. So what happens to that character that suddenly has like almost feels like an invincible amount of power? And, I don't think it would be fair to say that any of us would handle that well, right? But particularly at 15.
Yeah.
And so part of his sort of coming of age story is that arc, right? Dealing with having sort of gone into sort of a dark place with this power, and then how to kind of let that go at some point.
Yeah, I feel like at first he doesn't realize that like he's changing, but like Lilyfax, like you can instantly tell through her perspective, like something's different about him.
Right.
He doesn't really know what it is at first, but something feels off, and he's not the same Leo she's used to.
Yeah. He and that's, I think, the way we kind of all are. Like sometimes we can see things in our brothers and sisters that they can't see in themselves. So she's kind of a conscience for him in the beginning until he gains his own.
Yeah, his whole arc was interesting because you got a sense in the beginning that, okay, he's just going to be a pushover for the whole story. 'Cause even his own family was kind of looking at him as, below them. Like his two brothers made him do the work. His
cousin was a douchebag.
Yeah. And his mom was basically putting all the weight of the world on him to go find his dad. I don't want to give away much, that's early.
Sure.
So we can say that. But did you see that arc? It's almost like he finds himself at some point and just changes the direction of the whole story. I found it very interesting. What got me was the part early on when the alchemist came in. And you got the sense because of the time period of this story, the Great Depression, very religious. He was looked at like, we don't want that snake oil stuff. It's not going to work. You know what I mean? I appreciate the way you kind of slid that in and that whole development there, because nowadays we're like, hey,
science.
Yeah, nowadays we're like, hey, give me the drugs.
We are like, give me the drugs. But if you kind of look at, unfortunately, we're still having some of these discussions. Like, we're not going to believe climate science because, or I don't really understand why we're not going to, but because it doesn't fit our worldview or whatever. So in the story, there's kind of that conflict between progress and then the old ways, right? and then it's religion versus science.
Yeah.
And I think, again, unfortunately, we're still having some of that discussion, pulling books off the shelf, things like that.
And I don't think that's ever going to end. I don't
No,
know.
it's probably not. And that's what's the sad part is you can look at some of these themes in this book from the 1930s.
When Earth blows up, it will. But
exactly.
It's the flat Earth, though, right, Jay? It's not round.
It's it's not going to. It's more of a pancake. It'll just be a wave,
Yeah.
So I think, unfortunately, that's still with us. So it is a theme in the book. Again, that push and pull.
Was the alchemist? Was he a fun character for you to write? Because he's a bit different.
He was a fun character.
Quirky in a way.
I'm sorry. Kind of eccentric, and he's based on someone that I met in terms of like he has this really weird way of speaking, and I literally knew the person that had it. So like the S sound is a Z sound for everything, and so he was a lot of fun to kind of write, sort of eccentric kind of character. Who has this, basically he's kind of a huckster for fake cures in a certain sense, and then on the other hand, maybe he is peddling some real medicines and things like that. We don't really know. And then he obviously is a bootlegger as well. So he was a lot of fun to write, and there's a lot of that kind of character in that time period and earlier. Sort of the man traveling with all the tonics in the briefcase. Yeah. So he was a lot of fun to write.
I mean, who wouldn't trust a guy walking up to the front door with a briefcase full of liquids and stuff?
Exactly. Asking for tips first.
Asking for money right away.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me get the tip, and then I'll.
Nowadays that happens, and we're like, all right, come on in. I'll make you some coffee. What do you got?
Yeah, now they're pharmaceutical reps, and I think they make really good money.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
Did you have for you, in your opinion, who is the most deplorable character for you to write?
Well, there is only one character that we don't see a redeeming element in.
Okay.
Can you think of who that might be?
For me, the most deplorable one was Wormley.
That's the one. So Reverend Wormley, and so what I kind of set up in Reverend Wormley is sort of that quintessential hypocritical character, right? Who is saying one thing as a preacher and saying, one thing as kind of like this upstanding citizen in the community, and then doing the opposite. He's visiting the brothel, he's doing other things, and he's involved with worse things. Later on, we find out he's in the Klan and stuff like that. So, I think we all kind of know those people that sort of like outward face. I do kind of try to contrast him when there's a Reverend Harmon. He doesn't have a big role in the book, and then there's the church builder, Mr. Goodman. So there are a couple of characters who are, sort of like benevolent and good. So, hopefully not every character comes across as horrible. But he was interesting to write just because, and I did think long and hard in terms of like his story arc, like, trying to give him some nuance like we had with Wake and so forth. And I just couldn't find it. We know those characters and we know those people. And to me, they don't have a lot of redeeming characters. Wake, while he's doing something in some ways worse than what Wormley's doing because he's harming people, he, in his mind, like he's trying to do something according to a code of behavior, whereas Wormley has no code, right? And he's at the same time sort of professing to tell you what your code should be. And so he's maybe the arguably the true villain of the book.
Yeah, Wormley, I just kind of got.
He was greasy, gross feeling every time.
Yeah, like the thin comb over, grease, always sweaty.
Always sweaty in the wintertime.
The ill-fitting suit that's kind of like halfway tied.
I pictured the guy running for governor or running for mayor in Oh Brother Where Art Thou? That's
that's perfect. I mean, that would be perfect. He's also he's got those deplorable physical attributes. And
I'm actually picturing somebody else right now that's kind of in politics, but we won't go that. We better not, because I'm going to get canceled.
He's got the wallet full of cash too. So that's the other thing. Right. He's very affluent.
That's what I'm leaning towards. So
off the backs of his congregants or followers, as we could say. So I think we're on the same page there.
Right.
Yeah.
I better stop. I'll get
Jay,
Brad's show
don't
shut
make
down.
it crash and burn in a second, Jay.
Yeah. We'll get all kinds of hate mail pretty soon here.
Right.
All three people that have listened to the show.
thousands.
How long did it
in the reviews? So.
How long did it take you to? When did you start writing this? And how long did it take you to get from beginning to end?
Yeah, so this book took about 4.5 years to write. So I started in 2017. So the best sort of analogy I've heard for writing novels is comparing it to building a house. So the analogy goes like this: if I gave you all the materials you needed, Jay or Brad, to build a house, you had everything you need, but you had to do it all by yourself with your labor, how long would it take you? Right?
It would never get
8
done.
years, 10 years. Like, it would take you a really long time. But then if I said, okay, now I want you to build another one, hopefully you learn some things along the way. You learn like how to use the T-square to cut your wood and all the things that you need to do to like take less time and you don't screw up as much. So I think writing books is kind of the same way. So it doesn't mean that you eventually get to where you can pound one out in a few months or anything. But the first novel took me about 4.5, 5 years to write. I workshopped it in my MFA program. I had a lot of beta readers, did a tons of rewrites, got a lot of feedback, and then kept sort of like molding the story to make it stronger.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now I've written the sequel to this novel, which comes out next fall.
That's my next question.
September, from Quill and Crow Press. So the first book is coming from Cowboy Jamboree Press. Quill and Crow is going to do the second one. And that one took me less, maybe 3 years.
Okay.
So does that mean it's a better book? I don't know. But I think that I learned a lot of stuff along the way. I didn't have to do as many like complete rewrites and things like that as I did on the first one. So I think for writers, there is kind of this curve. Again, not that you ever get to this point where you got it figured out or anything like that, but you learn from those early experiences and gain some efficiency.
Yeah.
So,
is it a direct sequel or is it?
It is a loose sequel.
Okay.
So you won't have to have read this one to get it, but it's set in the 1980s. So the kind of the fun thing about it is, if you think this book, Where Dark Things Grow, is kind of in that vernacular and language and time of my grandparents, the one from the 80s is in my voice and my generation. Okay. So in some ways that was a little bit easier to write because that's a world I knew.
Did you use Cowabunga?
I don't think I used Cowabunga, but there are some other cultural references in there. And I had to do things like Google, like, did they really say that in 1987 or was that 1990? Things like that. So, but
I know you. Go ahead,
that's a long story, long way to say, it took me about 4.5 years. Next book took me a little bit less. And what's interesting is for the reader's experience, one's coming out fall 2024, the next one fall 2025. So I had a few writer friends like, how'd you do that so fast? Like, okay, this is 8 years.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah. Right.
This is not, didn't do this overnight.
Brad was born in 2000, so it'll be like
2007 actually. So
another history lesson for him. Like,
nice.
Did you guys really have mullets back then?
Yeah.
What's the title of the second book?
It's called Where Dark Things Rise.
Okay.
So we decided to keep something a little bit similar, so to kind of cue the reader in that this is a sequel.
Okay.
But it's a very different book. The main protagonist in that book is a female, and so if you think about the evil that we kind of deal with in the first book, it's back in the second book.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was going to say a few of the characters from the first book they're still alive. They're in their 70s. And so sort of the next generation, again, teenagers are the brunt of the story. They're kind of taking this issue or this evil on the new generation.
You got me interested because now I'm picturing characters dressing up like Crockett and Tubbs. I'm sure I'm far from it.
They got the members only jacket.
Yeah, the members only jacket. All that stuff.
The
fanny pack and
absolutely
the fat shoestrings and
Swatch watches. The preppy boys all wear the Swatch watches and have their collars up and shit.
Listen to Phil Collins and
absolutely.
Yeah.
It was, like I said, it was fun in that way, just because that was my world. So that was, that part of it was very fun. Yeah. It was, I guess, in some ways, a little bit more challenge. Like, how do I bring the sort of magical stuff to that world? And thankfully, there's like lots of great, 80s horror movies and horror books that give you lots of great inspiration and fodder for that.
Right.
just the vibe of it's giving me It vibes, where the kids have grown up now, but the evil's back and they have to fight the
Absolutely. Yeah. But the kids are in their 70s, right?
Yeah.
The ones from the first book. So now this new generation has to deal with it.
Oh, so they're using the clapper.
Yeah, the clapper's in there. Got to get that in there.
I'll
probably go revise it. I'll probably go revise it just to add the clapper.
There you go. Yeah. Or are the where's the beef?
Where's the beef?
Sorry, we're going down stuff that Brad's got to look up when we get off the show.
Max Headroom. There's just so many things we could stick in there.
You got to put the commercial in there. Where your kids? It's 10 o'clock.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
With that stuff too, I think it's kind of like what you said earlier, Jay, about the vernacular, like less is more. Yeah. So that's one thing I had to, and especially in doing revisions, kind of like I don't maybe need as many references as I've got in here, where the readers are like, I see what you're doing.
Right.
Like, just relax.
You got to make sure you have a rotary phone. And
a
VCR.
They have the phone. They got to stretch the cord down the hall to try to get privacy.
Yeah. Be on the wall,
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah. What's next for you to promote this one? I know I think I saw on Twitter or someplace you had like a long list of like a little tour you're doing.
Yeah, doing a little sort of regional tour. So on Tuesday night, my launch is at Malaprops in Asheville. Okay. So launching the book that's the day it comes out on the 10th. And then 2 days later, I'll be in Greenville, South Carolina. And then on Sunday, I'll be in, I've got a couple events in Asheville that week. The 13th, I'm participating with some other horror writers as a signing here locally. That's information's on my website. And then Haunt Fest, there's a kind of a spooky festival that a couple of horror writers from Asheville are going to go and have a book booth there and hang out, get dressed up and all that stuff. And then on the 15th, I'll be in Woodstock. And then on the 25th of September, I'll be down in Savannah. So got a few things kind of lined up and a few more kind of in the works. Just try to get out and meet people, meet readers and chat and talk about the book and all that kind of fun stuff.
And what's the official release date?
September 10th. So this coming Tuesday.
And that's the kickoff. Okay.
That's going to be with Malaprops, and Megan Lucas is going to be in conversation with me there.
I've heard of her.
Yeah. She's okay.
Yeah. She's okay.
Yeah.
She's all right. Yeah.
Absolute rock star.
Yeah. Yeah. Andrew, I mean, it's been a pleasure. I'm glad you decided you wanted to, hang out with us this evening on a Friday night and chat about the book. It can be pretty heavy in some spots, so yeah, that's pretty cool. We appreciate you wanting to stop by and do this. So, before we get out of here, you want to give one more final push for people, what they can expect to get them to come out and pick it up?
Absolutely. Yeah. So first of all, thank you guys for having me. You guys have had some amazing guests on here. It's just an honor to be listed as among your guests. So really appreciate you having me, spend some time with me on a Friday night. And yeah, so Where Dark Things Grow is coming out Tuesday, 1930s, Western North Carolina, Appalachian Gothic, horror, magical realism story, also coming of age story with historical fiction elements. So it's a pretty interesting ride, some darkness, as the title implies, but then there's also some moments of brevity along the way too, I hope. But again, really appreciate it. And folks want to kind of connect with me, that I'm on all the socials, but if you go to andrewkclark.com, there's no E on the Clark. It's just ANDREWKCLARK.com. You can see all the events I've got planned there, and then connect with me on the socials there.
Oh, great. Where Dark Things Grow. I just like the title of that.
Thank you.
I love that you got a blurb from Andy Davidson. I love his books.
Yeah, now Andy Davidson.
I feel like he's not.
Oh gosh.
I feel like people don't talk about him as much.
Oh my God. He's for Southern horror writers, I don't know anybody better in the game. He is very, very strong. I mean, Nathan Ballingrud is also very strong from here in Asheville. But to me, what Andy does so well is sort of mixing that Southern Gothic vibe in with his horror, right?
Oh, yeah.
And The Boatkeeper's Daughter, that was a comp I used when I was creating my book. So it's one I think that there's some similar stuff going on. And then The Hollow Kind is just amazing. Oh, so yeah, I can't say enough.
It's so good.
Yeah, I can't say enough good about him, and also just the generosity to take the time to read my book and blurb it. Kind of a nobody debut novel, just a very generous human being, along with Jason Mott and Ivy Pacoda and other folks who blurred my book. Again, very, very grateful. And it's one of those moments where you kind of like really appreciate the writing community and how everybody's kind of trying to help each other along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because in the beginning for the arcs we got, there was a lot of praise in there, a lot of blurbs from a lot of people. That's really cool.
Yeah. I asked a lot of folks I knew as a debut novel. I needed some folks to vouch for me, so I, cast my net pretty wide, and I was very thankful that, again, some very established and great writers. Jason Mott, Hell of a Book is one of my favorite books. He writes kind of that magical stuff. He's got a book called The Returned, which is really cool, about kids coming back from the dead, right? And just showing up at dinner and shit like that. It's fantastic, and a TV series was made out of it. But
I was going to say, was that a TV series?
It was. And but yeah, it's another example of National Book Award winner, North Carolina writer. I've just met him briefly before, and took the time to read my book and write a wonderful blurb for it. So just very, very grateful.
Nice. Yeah, I'm gonna check that out now.
Yeah, it's a great book.
I forgot about that TV series. Yeah.
Yeah, it's The Returned is a great book, and the series is pretty good too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was HBO, wasn't it? Was that HBO series?
I think so.
Was it HBO? I thought it was like ABC or something. I remember. I don't know.
I think it's HBO.
Not positive. Yeah, I'd have to look that up.
Yeah, definitely.
But the book I can definitely vouch for.
All right. Well, again, thanks for joining us. And I think the chat was broken again tonight. It's been doing that a couple times, but we'll get plenty of eyes on this. We'll promote it and spread it around and stuff. So again, thanks for hanging out with us. Hopefully we didn't put too much of a damper into your Friday evening.
It was amazing. Thank you guys. It was a great conversation. I appreciate the fact that you guys had read it so closely and came, that means a lot too. I know it's a lot to ask folks to read your book and, have you on the show. So I really appreciate you having me.
Well, good luck with the success of it. And hopefully this little tour, you'll get some extra eyes on it too. So
you have to come back for book 2. We talked
definitely.
About, I love that. I love
Rising.
that. It comes next.
We'll do like an 80s trivia to add in there too.
Yeah, that'd be fun. we can cue up some 80s music and all that stuff.
There you go. Well, that's going to be a wrap, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. This edition of Paper Cuts, where dark things grow. Andrew K. Clark, our guest this evening. He's going to be out doing a worldwide tour. No, okay, maybe not worldwide, but and then the book is this Tuesday. That's the 10th, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So pick it up. Brad, any parting words?
Andrew, just appreciate you coming hang out with us, spending your time with us. It was a blast getting to chat with you about the book.
Thank you. Again, I had such a good time.
That's going to do it. Until next time, everyone.
Love you, Jay.
I know you do.